I'm happy to come back to Göttingen to have a chance to present to this particular mixture of international scholars from all over the place. And I was inspired by the beautiful space that we were in yesterday, which evokes very clearly a sort of idea of the Southeast Asian Gothic, which is, as a matter of fact, something I'll be talking about. Now, my actual title is Re-orienting Religious Space in Southeast Asia and North America, from Syncretism to Diaspora. And the paper explores two key concepts which seem to relate quite differently to the spatialization of religion. Let's see. Syncretism is a mixing and synthesizing of different religions to create a sense of unity in one place, and diaspora normally is understood as the creation of a sense of unity across different places. So syncretism is often seen as a localization or indigenization of world religions, while diaspora involves the sacralization of the idea of home through the experience of exile and dispersal. One brings varied elements together in a single place and describes a process of combination and reconfiguration as the followers of different religious traditions interact. The other exports local visions or combinations to distant places, but continues to bind them through emotional and spiritual ties to the place of origin. I'm going to start with spiritism, with syncretism. Syncretism is a word that evokes and awakens strong passions. Studies of syncretism acknowledge the fact that all religions are historically constructed, that their boundaries are permeable and fluid. But they may also evaluate this fluidity. For some, syncretism is desirable, since it is a sign of tolerance, of symbiosis, and mutual respect. For others, it's negative, since it is a corruption of religious integrity, a contamination of the authentic tradition with indigenous or inappropriate content. And it's this combination of the analytic use of the term syncretism and the evaluative use of the same term that has made scholars suspicious of it and has even moved some scholars to ban it from their vocabularies. And I've realized recently that my two different area interests, Indonesia and Vietnam, in certain ways represent not only the polarities on the map of Southeast Asia, but also polarities in relation to their position in relationship to syncretism. Earlier this year, I presented versions of this paper at two institutions, the National University of Singapore and the Vietnam National University in Ho Chi Minh City. At NUS, Nancy Florida, who originally came from the University of Michigan, told me passionately that, quote, she did not believe in syncretism, and she did not think the word should ever be used by scholars. And obviously Peter has already seen yesterday, so I can talk about it more today. We've already gone there. Her position, however, was that as a specialist on Javanese court culture, she'd seen the word used to argue that the Javanese practices of synchronistic combinations of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam were not authentically Muslim, and people who follow what Clifford Geertz once controversially called abangan or village traditions, or even priyayi elite traditions, were being persecuted as apostates, condemned as traitors to Islam, and targeted by purifying reformist militias. So she was committed to showing how Javanese court officials fit into a centuries-old Sufi tradition, which was also thoroughly, quote, Islamic. A month earlier, in Ho Chi Minh City, I encountered virtually the opposite response. A Vietnamese professor of comparative theology told me that in Asia, and he used the term Asia, which we might modulate perhaps, but drawing on more than one religious tradition has almost never posed problems, existential, doctrinal, or otherwise. The explicit theorizing of the issue by theologians in the Western Academy, according to him, reflects particular intellectual currents that have converged to construe religions as discrete entities, but this was never how they were perceived in East Asian civilization. It was the 19th century invention, or at least labeling of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, as well as Hinduism, as specific isms that made religious mixture into a problem when it had not been a problem at all to practitioners in the past. So how can we make sense of this? Let's try an ethnographic example. And of course here I'm showing, this is in fact an image from California, from Garden Grove. But it's an image of the Kadai Pantheon. And as it turns out, the second speaker in Ho Chi Minh City was a follower of Taoism, the third religion of Vietnam, which worships the great figures. You see Buddha there at the very top. You have Confucius in red, Lao-Tzu in blue, Kwanam or Guan Yin on one side, the red-faced Hong Kong or Guan Yu on the other side. Then we have the invisible Pope of Kadaism is the man just below Buddha there. It's called Li Tai Bach in Vietnamese. Li Bai is the Tang Dynasty Taoist poet. Then you have Jesus Christ with the bleeding heart on his chest, and you have Kong Tai Kong, who's an image of the veneration of ancestors. This particular mixture has proved a volatile one in many contexts. Dadaism has been described as an extreme or outrageous form of syncretism. The French called it a syncretisme à l'outrance, because it combines these three great Asian traditions with elements of Roman Catholicism, French Spiritism, Theosophy, and Freemasonry. Its excessive, even transgressive combination of the gods of East and West, and of piety and blasphemy, respectful obedience and rebellious expressionism opened it up to critical evaluations and almost 80 years of misunderstandings. For scholars of Islam, and particularly in an earlier era, Christianity, syncretism was such a negative word that it had to be banned to prevent the persecution of even the most mildly idiosyncratic practitioners. For scholars of the three great Asian traditions, and there aren't only three great Asian traditions, but I'm speaking in a Vietnamese idiom here, it was useless for almost the opposite reason, because the idea of multiple religious belonging was so evidently common and desirable, it was redundant to speak of syncretism when clearly the symbiotic coexistence or interpenetration of these various traditions could only serve to enrich human society. So syncretism is given a negative, pejorative meaning by the proponents of revealed religions, many of them, who often try to deny that their own beliefs and practices were historically constituted. And we had a reflection of this in what we heard yesterday, the criticisms from Bourdieu. The alchemy metaphor is a popular one. Mixtures can either combine together to create a compound, which is a new entity, a synthesis, or they can coexist in two ultimately irreconcilable substances which will separate over time, like oil and water, because their component parts are incompatible and must remain forever distinct. Fundamentalists assert that religious or cultural essences should be preserved over history through a series of purification projects designed to return each substance to its original revealed truth. Syncretism is, however, the enemy of fundamentalism. In order to move towards a more positive sense of syncretism, we then have to look at it as a process, a kind of project in itself, which moves from an implicit stage to a more explicit one and acquires a more complex, often hierarchical, and deliberate character in the second stage. So I'm going to distinguish here between an implicit syncretism, which works through idiosyncratic adjustments, the decision to appeal to a new god here, adopt a new practice there. It involves a tacit sense of correspondences without extensive reflection or deliberate selection. Its logic is instrumental and moved more by concerns with efficacy. You use something that works rather than theology. Explicit syncretism involves the conscious selection and combination of different traditions, often led by an intellectual elite, which produces new doctrines and a new religious field. Now, I'm arguing that syncretism is a useful term. I don't think we should ban it from our vocabularies, because it helps us to focus on a particular stage in religious mixing and development, the explicit syncretizing moment, when religious mixing becomes conscious and is reflected upon. Intellectuals and religious specialists can become explicit syncretizers as a retrospective justification of popular religious mixing. This is when the transition from the implicit instrumental religion is made to explicit doctrinal syncretism. The moment of reflexive awareness is a theologizing moment, a time when implicit connections need to be made explicit. Now, I argue that Dadaism is a more explicit form of syncretism. And here we're looking, notice this looks a bit like the room we were in yesterday, but more colorful. This is the interior of the Tay Ninh Great Temple in Vietnam. But this explicit syncretism builds on a much longer tradition. For Over 1,000 years, Vietnamese people practiced a symbiotic fusion of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and scholar officials applied for government positions by writing essays commenting on the relationship of the three great traditions. The implicit mixture of these three teachings, none of them explicitly formulated as a religion before the late 19th century, was destabilized by colonial conquest. Southern Vietnam became the first part of Eastern Asia to be brought under full European colonial rule, a rule that was complete only in the Saigon area, what was called Cochin China, and was less complete in other parts of French Indochina, which were protectorates under the indirect rule funneled through the Nguyen imperial dynasty. The generation of Cao Dai founders in 1925 sought to unite all the Vietnamese people into a single national religion, which could be called a kind of Vietnamism, similar to Hinduism, if you wish, which would provide the spiritual basis for achieving independent national sovereignty. They did so by using organizational elements borrowed both from the Catholic Church and, less obviously, but clearly also from Chinese redemptive societies, as well as spiritist texts from French writers like Victor Hugo and Alain Kardec. Half a century later, the generation of diasporic Cao Dais in 1975 were refugees and exiles who reworked the doctrines of this new religion to make it into a more flexible faith of unity which could develop outside of Vietnam and expand its syncretism into a new cosmopolitanism. Today, Cao Daism has about 4 million followers. It's still the third largest religion in Vietnam after Buddhism and Catholicism. It squeaks into one of the top 10 world religions categories in a number of, depending on how you count it, but in a number of cases, and it is certainly becoming a global presence. Cao Daism is visually displayed in its eclectic religious architecture. The front of a Cao Dai temple looks like a Gothic cathedral in Technicolor. It has high Gothic towers, a vaulted ceiling, a nave, and various columns. And you have, right at the front, the female founder of the religion, who is on what is conceptually the right side, because you're facing God when you do this, and the male founder of the religion is what is conceptually the left side. However, from the side, and this is why European visitors almost always describe this as a sort of cathedral. From the side, however, you see that most of the structure is in fact behind you, and the European front is, and it is the European front in the full sense of the word. The European front is the least sacred part of the structure, and the marble floors and dragons, in fact, come 9 ascending levels, which you can see here on the side view, that each of these levels going towards the back is a little bit higher. There's an onion dome in the center, which has this sort of dragon horse figure ridden by the Maitreya Buddha, and there is an octagonal gold-plated palace at the end, which is called the 8 Trigram Palace. And here you have a view of the Background Dai. And this is where divination, spirit writing, and the most important conversation with divinities take place. This is also the first part built and the first part renovated every time they paint the structure. So what we see is that you enter through a European front and you walk up in ascending levels to a huge globe bearing the left eye of God, symbolic of a positive dynamic in Asian monotheism, a pantheon headed by the Jade Emperor, which includes Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu at the highest rank, and puts Jesus at the third level as the leader of what's called the Way of Saints. And therefore we have a vision of a powerful, forceful, masculine Asian deity, inverting what Edward Said would call us the conventions of Orientalism, given through a particularly strong visual language. I'm going to, however, add another stage to this argument by saying that when a religion travels, when Cao Daism, for instance, became one of the new immigrant religions in North America and Europe, it was challenged to become more self-reflective as well. So the formation of a diasporic religion involves a replaying of this explicit syncretizing moment in a new landscape. But first I'm going to explore the relation between syncretism and diaspora by looking at the creation of Cao Daism in colonial Saigon. French discourses of comparative religion and secularism certainly influenced the formation of this new religion, particularly because Vietnamese intellectuals perceived it as being basically under attack. And this is the opening passage of Leopold Cadier's description of the religion of the Vietnamese, which is the first serious study of Vietnamese religion done during the colonial period. And he says, Vietnamese religion, if indeed one can use the singular, produces an impression like that which is inspired by journeying into the great forests of the Anamine Cordillera. On all sides are great tree trunks, their roots penetrating to unfathomable depths, supporting a vault of foliage lost in shadow. Branches stoop down to the earth and take root. Seemingly endless creepers run from tree to tree, their origins indiscoverable. While this description is not without an appreciation for the aesthetic value of Vietnamese ritual, there are inextricable thorns and fronds of surpassing elegance and delicacy. He also stresses elements of decadence. The bark of the trees is dark, gnarled, or slimy. One cannot touch it without a shudder, and there are dead branches upon a thick carpet of mold and decay. And yet he also finds within it vitality and exuberance which is inspiring. On all sides, sap thrusts up and life abounds in overwhelming profusion. What he doesn't find, however, is coherence, or order, or a logical relation between the parts. He argues that religious feeling makes itself fully manifest and dominates the whole of life in Vietnam, but describes it as parading in the pomp of official ceremonies or lurking furtively at the foot of a tree or in front of a rough stone. Because of strong religious feeling, Vietnamese may bow down before baleful idols, in his language, or make a serpent into an object of worship. Quoting him again, magic with its barbaric or absurd practices is mingled with the noblest of religious observances. While he recognizes the Buddhist and Taoist elements, he concludes that in the bulk of its beliefs and practices, Vietnamese religion is close kin and almost confounds itself with the baser religions characteristic of primitive mountain dwellers. So these are the kind of descriptions that inspired the rage of a group of Southern Vietnamese intellectuals. They responded to this kind of critique by deciding they needed their own Jesuits, and this is a term I've heard them use. They needed their own religious scholars who would help them to claim a position within the religious field and reinvent Vietnamese traditions as a religion that could be as centralized and imposing as the Catholic Church. And they needed a Vatican in Vietnam with a powerful administrative hierarchy and the capacity to transform worldly service to their religion into celestial ranks after death. And here you see a group of these dignitaries who are color-coded by the particular tradition they follow. The ones in saffron yellow follow a Buddhist tradition, are concerned more with charity. Those in turquoise follow the Taoist tradition, work more with spiritism and occultism. And those in red, it's a cardinal red, so this is for administration and imperial power. Now, these intellectuals received spirit messages telling them that the Supreme Being had recognized their sufferings and their humiliations and would provide them not only with a divine mandate to organize such a religion, but also a set of revelations to guide its growth. And they received these revelations through spirit writing, which is an ecstatic technique that produces new texts. In some ways, this also complicates Peter Jackson's opposition of ecstatic syncretism to textual fundamentalism, because you go into trance and receive a series of complex new scriptures. One of which I'm showing you right now. This is a text delivered on Christmas Eve in 1925 at midnight by the spirit of Cao Dai, which translates as the highest power, and Cao Dai is another name for the Jade Emperor. And he told the three founding mediums of Cao Daism, for as long as we have seen the southern country, and this is a reference to Vietnam, Nam in fact means southern, has not had its own religion. Its foundations must now be laid. I, as the highest master, have founded the Tao in the southern region to compensate a country that since the beginning of its history has regularly suffered my vicissitudes. This time, I've decided to forgive you for your sins and redeem you by returning glory to your country. From this day on, there is only one true religious pathway, the Tao, and that is my pathway, that of your master, which I founded for my disciples and named as the national religion of this region. Have you understood me? And this defined, in many ways, this bold new direction that Cao Daism was about to go. These are the three founding mediums who are represented now at the near the entrance to the temple in Tianyin. In 1926, 28 prominent Indo-Chinese leaders, teachers, civil servants, businessmen, and landowners, and 254 others signed a public document which established them as the founders of Kadaism. So it was founded by a committee, in many ways. This was a sort of declaration of religious independence, which clearly stated that dozens of once secret societies were to be united under one banner to reform morality and revive traditional ethics. What was not explicitly stated, but was clear for everyone to see, was that this ambitious unification of religious groups in Vietnam was meant to create a community strong enough to stand up to both the French Catholic Church and the secular French state. Since 1905, France has had the strongest separation of church and state of any European power, and it guarantees the neutrality of the state and the freedom of religious exercise. While the colonial state made no such guarantee of political freedoms, especially for incipient nationalists, when a community was incorporated as a religion, it would be hard to challenge its legality. Agents of the French secret police suspected that Kadaism was a political movement masquerading as religion, so they sent secret agents to spy on religious ceremonies. The reports in the colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence are indexed under politics, not religion. But the committee of leaders who founded Kadaism were part of an intellectual elite, and they were something of a revolutionary vanguard. They recognized the strategic advantage of seeking to reform the country through a religious vision at a time when there was a severe repression of political dissent. The kinds of moral and ethical reform they proposed were part of a nationalist project, but their own redrawing of the borders around religion, modeled to some extent on Western notions, were also motivated by a shrewd analysis of what could be prohibited by a secular state and what it would be forced to tolerate. They then built their splendid holy city, including the Great Temple with the Gothic front that I've shown you, 1,338 smaller versions of that temple throughout the countryside, and at this point, almost a dozen replicas in temples overseas, in Little Saigon, California, this is the one I'm showing you, flying the American flag, as well as New Orleans, Dallas, Houston, Wichita, Kansas, Montreal, and Paris. This edifice complex buttressed a congregational and ceremonial form of ritual that in many respects resurrected the vestments and pomp of the now banned Confucian rituals. The high-pointed hats that you saw worn by Kadai dignitaries are modeled on those of Confucian scholars who presided at imperial examinations. Now, I'm arguing that what they did was to create a new religious field and invest a number of traditional elements with a new significance and dynamism. And this concept of a religious field comes from Bourdieu. His name also has already been invoked at this conference. But Bourdieu basically is doing an analysis of religion within fields of power, and he argues that a religious field comes into being when we have a class of religious specialists who emerge and try to centralize, systematize, and control a body of knowledge. And this is explicitly what Kadai leaders said they wanted to do. They assert religious authority, and they create a field of power in which others are disqualified as lay people or dismissed as practicing superstition, magic, or some lower form of popular religion. Now, in many ways, this is described as a modernization of religion, but it can also be the opposite of modernization. It can be a defensive weapon used by advocates of tradition who want to claim the same status for the beliefs and practices they already have as the beliefs and practices of Christianity. And it was obviously formed as a result of a dialogue between Vietnamese heritage, Christian missionaries, and secularizing political reformers and revolutionaries. Now, the Kadai pantheon of saints includes not only Asian figures and Jesus Christ, but also famously Victor Hugo, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, De La Fontaine, even Vladimir Lenin. And this is why you have this idea of an outrageous syncretism. And this is the mural that you see at the entrance to the Great Temple in Tianyin, where you see Sun Yat-sen on the far side, the patron saint of Asian nationalism, Victor Hugo in the robes of the Académie Française, and then Trang Trinh, who was a Vietnamese poet and prophet who was the first person to speak the word Vietnam back in the 16th century. Now, Victor Hugo was significant to colonized intellectuals because he was a proponent of popular emancipation, an opponent of the death penalty, the sworn enemy of Napoleon III, who was the conqueror of French Indochina. Transcripts of spiritist seances in which Hugo participated in 35 were published in 1924, and they have messages from Jesus reconsidering aspects of Christianity and prophecies that a new global religion would emerge in the 20th century, with Hugo as one of its prophets. So Victor Hugo, this way, sort of applied for the position of a Kharai prophet, and he was recognized 50 years after his death by these young Vietnamese intellectuals. This is a picture Hugo had taken of himself listening to God. And Hugo's spirit first made contact with the Kharai mediums stationed in Cambodia, and he therefore was made the spiritual head of the overseas mission, delegated to carry the message of Kharaism to France and initially other Francophone colonies. And Hugo was, in fact, a vegetarian. He dabbled in Orientalist fantasies and mysticism, so he seemed to form a kind of bridge between 19th century Romanticism and 20th century struggles for self-determination and social justice. Jeanne d'Arc, another Kharai saint, had, of course, already been canonized by the Catholic Church, but her status as a French national heroine depended on the story of a poor peasant girl who heard voices telling her to rise up against a foreign army occupying her homeland. And so the relevance for Vietnamese occupied by the French is fairly obvious. She calls for the people, she defends the right of each people to self-determination. The spirit of Lenin made contact with Kharai mediums in 1926, just 2 years after his death. Death is a prerequisite for taking part in spiritual communication. Many years, however, before Vietnam became a communist country. In this message, Lenin concedes that the revolution of the proletariat was already suggested in Buddhist ideas of equality, so the central moral lessons of communism were already there in the Asian tradition. So these European philosophers, writers, and revolutionaries who came down and provide teachings in Kharai sciences do so to preach against French colonial domination. They include Western figures as an argument for parity, for the fact that Asian literary figures were the equivalent of European ones, and they don't not so much the worship of the European figures themselves. The Kharais imagine the creation of a new religion as a conversation of sages of all ages, in which the founders of France's colonial heritage take seriously Vietnamese claims to sovereignty and autonomy. And it's based on a 3-stage eschatology leading to a third era. The official name of Khadaism is the Great Way of the Third Era of Salvation, when the world will be redeemed after many years of suffering. And explicitly in Khadaism, this third era is the post-colonial age. It comes after the fall of European empires, and it is therefore a religion of decolonization which fuses the project of restoring Vietnamese sovereignty with religious goals of moral and ethical revitalization. The Vietnamese are also identified as God's chosen people, who, as you noted in the message from the Jade Emperor, suffered greatly under the yoke of French colonialism, but would receive a special mission to reconcile the religions of the Occident and the Orient into a modern synthesis. Jesus is seen as a nationalist leader, the king of the Jews, who fought for the independence of his people against an empire based in Rome. So in some ways he was an anti-European religious agitator. However, Jesus owes filial piety to his father, the Jade Emperor, and is placed in a somewhat junior position in relation to older Asian sages like Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu. Khaodaists celebrate Christmas as the birth of a new savior, but give no special meaning to Easter, since all human beings are believed to reincarnate in new bodies, and in this sense return to the world in another corporeal form. The committee of prominent citizens who founded Khaodaism responded to these messages from the Jade Emperor and created an intricate administrative hierarchy, blending Confucian titles with Catholic ones. There's a pope who is called the Yaltong. The actual Catholic pope is called the Yalhuang, which is like religious emperor, so the Yaltong is a bit closer to president of the religion. There were both female and male cardinals, bishops, and there was this Vatican in Vietnam with 65 different religious offices. The head spirit medium, Pham Phong Tac, who was often mistranslated into English as the Pope of Khaodaism, and in fact was never the Pope, is called the Ho Phap, which actually translates as defender of the Dharma. And he became Khaodaism's most famous and controversial 20th century leader. Today, many people call him the Mahatma of Vietnam, and they compare him to Gandhi, because both Pham Phong Tac and Gandhi tried to use Orientalism against empire. They took ideas of Eastern spirituality embodied in this left eye. The left eye is closer to the heart, but it's also strong, masculine, dynamic, and positive. And they oppose it to Western materialism. The Westerners worship the right eye, which is closer to the brain. If you wonder, how do we know Westerners worship the right eye? You look at the $1 bill, the US dollar bill, and you will see an image of the right eye, which is, Americans call it the eye of Providence. And many Americans, I can tell you, are not aware that there's this tradition of Americans worshiping the right eye. But inverting this Orientalist stereotype of a passive feminized East, they reimagined Vietnamese religion in a way that could encompass Western religious traditions into a culmination of religious unity. Now, Pham Kon Tak himself was both a politician and a religious leader. He traveled to the Geneva peace talks to lobby against the partition of his homeland, but he, like Gandhi, was unsuccessful in the struggle and ended up fleeing arrest by the Indonesian government and dying in exile in Cambodia in 1959. In 1975, when Saigon fell, thousands of Kadais fled the country. Many of them in the first wave were young professionals, doctors, engineers, computer scientists, pharmacists, who had assisted the former regime or the American forces. There were a few more senior religious leaders, including a former ambassador to the US and Japan, who also co-founded the teaching center in Saigon. One of the most famous was a little girl named Kim Phuc, and she's pictured in this very famous image from the Vietnam War, was photographed running out of the Cao Dai Temple in Trang Bang in 1971, and she eventually settled in Canada. For about 25 years, Kanaism was closed down in Vietnam. Its 1,300 temples were boarded up, vacant, gathering dust. Many scattered communities of Vietnamese overseas gradually collected themselves into ethnic enclaves in California, Texas, Washington, Montreal, Sydney, and Paris. By the 1990s, they had formed a diasporic religion with a network of dozens of temples, websites, and volumes of new spirit messages published on the internet from 2000 on. They published books and pamphlets that argued that Kadaism needed to be kept alive by the overseas community since it was oppressed and paralyzed by the communist government in Vietnam. And this suggests a new dynamic to what's happening within this religion when it becomes diasporic. Now here I want to, I'm influenced partly by the work of Paul Christopher Johnson, who wrote a book called Diasporic Conversions, which is in fact about Garifuna. It's a Afro-American religion with homelands in Africa, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, and a strong presence in Los Angeles and New York. And Johnson argues that diasporas make religions by dislodging religious practices from their embedded unspoken status and making them a discrete object of contemplation. Which rituals can be revived in another land and which must be discarded? This needs to be renegotiated. Secondly, they require public recognition and usually translation and publication of religious texts. Thirdly, they require new spatial coordinates, from ceremonies held in apartment living rooms to the construction of new temples and cultural centers. And lastly, they catalyze new forms, sources, sites, and brokers of the sacred. For Kadais, a female spirit medium emerged as the founder of the first Kadai temple in California. You'll note the founding mediums in Vietnam were all male. There were in fact 12 zodiacal mediums, all of them male. And she received messages from a variety of spirits, including Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, which tied Kadaism to America's largest indigenous religion. Now, Johnson argues that when a religious group becomes diasporic, it starts to view itself against new historical and territorial horizons that change the configuration and meaning of its religious, ethnic, and even racial identifications in the present. Caudais of the founding generation of French Indochina defined their religion in contrast to the colonial horizon of French Catholicism and secular Freemasons. 50 years later, refugees and immigrants in California redefined their religious activities to fit a system of Sunday services instead of twice-monthly new moon and full moon observations. They also had a Christian majority horizon within a religiously plural society with a greater diversity of competing groups. New encounters with Protestants and evangelicals, Hindus, Muslims, Baha'is, and Mormons changed the religious landscape in significant ways. As the practitioners of an overtly and proudly syncretic religion, Kadais were challenged to articulate the convention of their scriptures in relation to a whole series of sort of interlocutors. At this temple in Pomona, which I'm picturing here, California, There are wall plaques with quotes from the scriptures of Islam, Baha'i, and the Church of Latter-day Saints, as well as Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and Christianity. And all of the temples in the United States and also in Canada also fly the flag of the Saigon Republic, which you can see right there, the yellow striped flag, marking their community as a continuation of a vanished nation. The temple in Paris is a little bit of a little Hanoi as opposed to a little Saigon, does not have this particular flag. So the memory of the past is transformed even as it is rebuilt in the new spaces of immigration. Despite the passionate desire of Tene and Kadais to follow the divine blueprint of their great temple overseas, there have to be many changes in the materials used, the placement of glass in the windows, limitations to zoning laws. The number of colors which could be put on the outside of the building is severely restricted in Orange County. And so these physical chart changes of substance and shade mirror conceptual changes in how this vividly eclectic temple would be perceived in conservative neighborhoods. Now, Maurice Halbach has argued that the materiality of religion, its rites, costumes, architecture, and offerings, provide the most stable component because there can be multiple interpretations of ritual actions, and there is a more splintering over doctrine than imagery. So, although there are minor differences in iconography between Tenian temples and some other denominations, some use statues, some use ancestral tablets, there's a common visual vocabulary shared across all of these groups. And it was enormously important to these communities in California to restore the materiality of Vietnamese ritual life, attaching symbols from the homeland to new sites in the host land. Now, diasporas have been defined as social identifications based on shared memory bridges linking a lived space and a left-behind place. And the kind of double consciousness that diaspora groups have, described by Gilroy for Black Atlantic religion, requires residing in at least two different places, at least in the imagination, and engaging with gaps in space and time or memory. These gaps become a source of meaning in diaspora religion through the ritualization of the idea of return, pilgrimage, which Guido has already talked about. Distance from the homeland is seen as displacement, disempowering, and the function of ritual is to seek a momentary reconnection. For some strongly anti-communist Kadais, talk of returning to today's Vietnam is blasphemous, since it implicitly recognizes the legitimacy of the present government, but it intensifies a longing for the lost country and a discourse of purity in exile. I'm seeing a new direction in more globally oriented Kadais who are moving from being a religion in diaspora to being a religion of diaspora. They're turning some of these gaps into strategic resources which become positive and empowering. The multiple global sites of Kadai temples have become a transnational network of great value not only to immigrants, helping them settle in a new land, but also to returning pilgrims and religious leaders. They provide the basis for creative exchanges and interactions, many of them carried out on the internet, and create a new cosmopolitan ideal. They can also embrace non-Vietnamese converts, like this African-American woman, Linda Blackney, who was ordained as a Kadai minister in 2009. And this is a photograph from her ordination ceremony in Pomona, California. For a younger generation of educated Vietnamese, the idea of studying and traveling overseas has become so alluring that diaspora communities are envied immensely. While many Vietnamese in California dream of returning to their roots, others in Ho Chi Minh City want desperately to be part of an international community. The two sides of the Pacific are now linked by dense networks of remittances, some of them channeled through temples and religious networks, most of them simply through family members. The people on the other side will be in Kiev, build new houses, educate the younger generation, and nourish new international aspirations. So the syncretistic totalizing theology of Kadaism provides a basis for these linkages and travel in both directions. Now, I'm coming to some conclusions. The study of syncretism is a study of how religious difference has been managed by separation, by opposition, by the erection of strict boundaries and territories, as we have in Abrahamic religions under the banner of a sort of exclusionist monotheism, or by incorporation, by fusion, by emphasizing common elements and finding certain overarching themes, as has been more of the tendency in fluid Asian traditions. Fluidity should not, however, be equated with incoherence, and in Asian traditions it's articulated in relation to hierarchical principles So a syncretistic religion is not a religion where anything goes, but is one in which differences receive less emphasis than an all-encompassing unity. Syncretism brings together disparate religious traditions in one place, creating a particular package in which elements are reordered in a specific way related to the needs of religious actors in a particular historical context. Vietnamese colonized intellectuals fused Chinese, French, and Vietnamese elements in a coherent belief system that they hoped would systematize all of the religious teachings found in 20th century Saigon. Syncretism, therefore, seeks intellectual unity and cohesion by fusing traditions from different times and places that come to coexist. When followers of a particular religion are spread out in the diaspora, the package is exported to new places. The spatial dispersion of believers motivates each smaller community to re-examine its faith and practices in the new context. Now, diaspora is a new term that has emerged in a globalized world of compressed time and space, where modern social media have made it possible for diasporic religious followers to remain part of a shared conversation, even across great geographical distances. So the syncretistic impulse of the founders of Taoism was to create spiritual unity in one place. Diasporic dispersal links a diversity of places to a single spiritual home. Although these seem to be opposites, one compresses conceptual differences into unity, the other unifies different locations through common origin. But what they share is that they both have models for managing and overcoming religious differences and geographical challenges. Facing the colonial crisis of meaning in French Indochina, early Taoists found ways of enlisting both Asian sages and prominent French figures in the defense of their own right to self-determination. Facing the tragic displacement of exile, refugees bound together and forged new ties to an idealized homeland in order to generate a sense of community and mission in the new world. And so I'm in a longer work that I'm trying to finish right now. I've basically taken life stories from people from this founding generation of 1925, the syncretizers, and juxtapose them with the life stories of this generation of 1975, the diasporic leaders, since each one is formulating a particular way of reconnecting their spiritual homeland through activism in overseas networks. In some cases, some person is following a teacher, sometimes a father, sometimes a grandfather, but they're engaged in a parallel process of reassessment, self-questioning, and self-cultivation. While separated by half a century of history and the world's widest ocean, these paired figures are following similar pathways and show a strong loyalty to a sense of ancestral heritage. In many ways, finally, syncretism diaspora are not so different after all. Diaspora reworks the idea of a national culture from a distance through the lens of exile. In today's world, they interact and influence the home country, not only through remittances, but also cultural exchanges. They evoke a remembered past, but rework it in order to move into the future. The Diaspora Project is an imaginative rehearsal of what isn't, but could be. Now, my title, of course, is drawn from Andre Gunder Frank's provocative and prophetic 1998 book on the global economy in the Asian age. The idea of reorientation examines the relationship between Asia and North America through another lens. Theology, theories of religious mixing, which attempt to bridge the great civilizational divides of the 21st century. For immigrants and exiles, diaspora can be constructed as a narrative of crossing and dwelling, in Thomas Tweed's terms, in which movement through space is given meaning by ideas of transcendent connection to home, making the longed-for land of origin into a holy land, Pangdia, of universal importance. Diasporas make new religions by creating the conditions for more syncretism through dialogues between followers of different religious traditions. In fact, Taoism could realistically be called a syncretic religious machine for producing and reaffirming diasporic sentiments, a religion that includes diaspora as one of its most significant doctrines. There was an early prophecy that it would be globalized in 1975. And to some extent, a belief system that draws on religious notions of diaspora and updates them to the 21st century to create a global syncretism. In this sense, it is itself a fascinating and innovative diasporic formation.